Thanks, Dale. I'm always honored to be a part of Stocker Day. I always see some of the same faces. It's just incredible that we've been doing this for 25 years, and I think one of the things that working for K-State, being a student here, seeing that transition, we're pretty big on legacy here, and that's kind of what this is a little bit about what this story that I'm going to tell you guys is about today, and that's about the Stocker unit and what Dale's done here is about as well. I guess to kind of Dale's point, I'm not sure that I accepted the challenge that he gave me, okay? What you all don't know about Dale is he actually called me, I think, around the 1st of October, which would be about 2 days after last year's Stocker Day, and he said, I want you to put Stocker Day on your calendar. I want you to talk about the focus on feedlot data. We'll come up with a title later. I said, yeah, it's on my calendar. I'll be there. Happy to come share some of this information with you guys. Then we were kind of, I'm not very gifted with titles, so a lot of times I'll send a few things. I'll say, just give it a title. I'll talk around it. And I see this one, it goes Future Trends. And so you'll notice on the slide up there, I kind of changed some things. I put future kind of off to the side. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time on future trends that I see in the data, okay? As an animal scientist, I don't like to prognosticate. I'm not an ag economist. I don't project things forward. I can do a pretty good job of telling you what has happened in the industry from the data. If you ask me to kind of get out more than 2 or 3 years, maybe not so much. I'm going to get pretty uncomfortable with that. But I think it's a really fun story to tell, and I think you guys will enjoy it as we walk through it as a group of producers. So, one of the things about change that you come to appreciate is it's always going on, but we never realize how much something has changed until we look back, right? And so sometimes looking where we've been, really makes us appreciate where we're at, how we got there, and some of those things. And so that's a big part of this story today. So I want to tell you a little bit about the focus on feedlots, because I think that kind of sets the stage for the data that I'm going to present, maybe answers some questions about how we do some things. So we've got the data electronically archived from 1990 to 2024. So some of the numbers that you're going to see today were published in June of 2024. So this is the most recent. This is July 2024's report here. You can see this is what it looks like. If you get the focus on feedlots, it'll come as an email attachment. We're kind of old-fashioned. I used to fax this to a few people. I've kind of weeded that out. I think there's 1 or 2 that still get it by fax. But most of it is communicated by email now. So what it essentially is it's a summary of feedlot closeout performance. Okay, so there's about 6 yards that it represents. So we collect basically data month in, month out on about 20,000 head of steer closeouts. 15 to 20,000 head of heifers would be represented in this. We collect in weight, final weights, average days on feed, average daily gain, feed to gain, death loss, average cost to gain. We also record some commodity prices. We do corn as well as ground alfalfa hay. We could argue whether or not I need to change that hay to include some other forages that are out there, but we've always recorded those, and in my mind, there's value. If you've been doing something for 30 years, you better still grab that number, right, so you can project it forward. The other thing that's unique about this data set in particular, okay, we also ask feed yard managers, what's your projected cost to gain for the current month's placed cattle, okay? And that is a pretty unique number. When I ask a few managers that question in the report, there's a few of them, they've got a formula. There's a few others where it's just kind of wherever their sentiment is for the month, okay? So some of them are pretty diligent in the data, others are not. So this is what the focus on feedlots looks like. In terms of the data, it is collected as a true survey, okay? So I don't get the numbers, I don't change them in any way, I simply report into the averages. So these are the averages of average feed yard closeouts. So I don't take the individual pen closeouts, I just report the averages that they give me. So I don't massage the numbers in any way. I've been asked, well, what happens if you get an error in it, Zach? I basically go into it, I call a feed yard and say, hey, I think something's wrong with your numbers. Most of the time they're like, yeah, hey, we did get something wrong. Thanks for letting us know, right? So that's about the data integrity and control. We do not share the information of individual feed yards publicly. About a year ago, I was actually subpoenaed and forced to give that data. So if you wonder about data integrity, I'll take it as far as you want to go with it. Legally, they have made me share some of that data, but if you share it with us, we'll hold that pretty close because it certainly does have value. So here at K-State, we talked about legacy, right? And that's big. And so I get to be the recipient of that, of some work of some people that are even still here in the audience today. So the focus on feedlots is much older than 1990. It actually goes back to the late 70s, Dr. Cool, that we pieced together last night. There's been a number of different faculty that have been associated with this data set over the years that through all of those transitions, and this is what impresses me about K-State, each one of those people saw value in making that data set work. Because it's not easy when you make a transition at our end, and it's also not easy when whomever you're getting that information on the feed yard side changes. They go, oh, well, we were sharing this data with K-State, right? Yeah, you were. I'd really like keeping the data set, right? You guys have been doing it for 20-some years. That has a lot of value to it. So maybe Phil Farr, Larry Cord, Jack Riley. One of the best decisions I think I ever made in my career when I came to K-State was Dr. Chris Reinhardt, former feedlot extension specialist, came to me and he said, hey, I want you to take over the focus on feedlots. I said, yeah, that'd be great. And at that time, newly minted graduate student, I probably didn't realize the value of this thing, but it is one of the things that I think keeps all of us in academia anchored to the cattle feeding industry. So our current feed yard contributors, and we could not do that without these feed yards, okay? And some of you here realize the value of data, okay? So we do not take lightly that they share this with us each and every month. So High Plains Feed Yard in Montezuma, High Choice Feeders, Scott County, Pokey Feeders, Deseret Cattle Feeders, Pratt Feeders, and Hoxie Feed Yard. Several of those feed yards have undergone some management and ownership changes over the years, and they still choose to contribute data to us. So back before Deseret was Deseret, it was Hitch, and Hitch was in the data set. So there's some really, really nice things about continuity that you don't have an appreciation for on the surface of this data set. But as we think about these historic trends, a lot of the same yards over time are going to be represented in some of the numbers that you're going to see today. So so we're going to look at it from two different perspectives before we jump into the future trends. So I want to take kind of a long-term trajectory approach. So we're going to look at data from 1990 to 2023, and then what I'm going to summarize for you guys is the annual averages from 1990 and 2023. So we're going to look at that trend, then we're going to look at individually, where were we at in 1990 in the industry, what did cattle look like, and then we're going to look at kind of that present-day approach at 2023. Then we're going to jump into some short-term and recent trends, and we're going to go 2019, 20, 21, and 22, and 23, that 5-year snapshot, okay? And so let's kind of jump into things. Sorry about the error there on my slide that I caught. I got a little extra tick mark in there. So all of the graphs today, okay, and hopefully this looks like it's showing up pretty well, okay? I was hesitant about this. Looks like it's showing up pretty well on the screen for you guys today. So all of the graphs that I'm going to show you, and I promise it's not a competition between me and Dr. Tonser of who's going to have graphs, the most graphs in a presentation, okay? I might win today. That's atypical for me. Usually I'm one of the guys that just throws a picture on the screen and talks about it. So this is going to be a little awkward for me as well. But there is a lot of graphs. But I think you guys will enjoy walking through, okay? So we're going to set these up for you. Boys in blue, girls in pink. So steers are going to be blue, heifers are going to be pink. We'll have years, so January of 1990 all the way to 23 on the bottom of the graph. And then whatever we're talking about is going to be on the Y, okay? I think all of us in the room today probably appreciate that cattle are bigger today than what they were 20, 30 years ago, right? The question becomes, how much bigger are they and how much quicker do we get them there, right? And so that's the conversation we're going to have. So if you look at the slope of the line for exit weight that's shown here, or market weight, that's a steadily increasing slope, right? And this is just a simple Excel trend line. I didn't do anything fancy, didn't throw anything at it. The keep it simple, stupid principle, right? The KISS principle. We're just going to draw a simple trend line through it, and we're going to talk about it. So you guys can take the data, you can go home. If you want to have some fun with Excel, you can walk through it. So essentially, the trend line for both steers and heifers in terms of exit weights has an identical slope, okay? That's pretty unique. They're both increasing at the same rate. That's what it tells us. That rate is 0.6 pounds per head per month. So this is a monthly trend line that's up here. That equates to 7.2 pounds per year. So if you do 10 years, that's 72 pounds. You go on further out, and you can just expand that number out. So in 1990, and this is an annual average. The annual exit weight average for steers in 1990 was 1,187 pounds and 1,041 pounds on heifers. So we were essentially making 1,200-pound steers and 1,000-pound heifers in 1990. We fast forward to 2023, that number looks like 1,425 on a steer, and it's going to be 1,292, pushing 1,300 pounds on those heifers. Okay, so if you look at just the incremental change there, okay, that's 238 pounds of live weight on those steers and 250 pounds on the heifers. Okay, so what excites me, and I'll get excited as I give this talk, but I think there's several things. You know, when you add 250 pounds of live weight, that's a tremendous increase on the hoof. We don't think about that. I think we lose sight of that. That's a 20% increase from 1990 to 2023 on the steers, and a 24% increase. They're almost 25% larger, okay? And I actually think the 2023 numbers are a little softer than they were a couple years ago, okay? So those numbers have been bigger in the past. So I think that's pretty impressive to me. The other thing that jumps out to me is that the slope of that line is the same for both the steers and the heifers. That's not always going to be the story that I'm going to tell you. Okay, so let's look at days on feed. We know those have increased. There's been a lot of conversation in the industry about increasing days on feed. So here's that graph for both steers and heifers. One of the things you appreciate about this line, the pink and the blue, they start to blur together. But when you look at the trends lines, they're both moving in the same direction. The slope is pretty similar in terms of the increase in days on feed over time that we've seen in the Focus on Feedlot data set. It's increased at a rate of about 0.09 days on feed per month, okay? That's not a very big number. That's not very real. If you extrapolate it out, it's a little over a day a year, okay? That's what that trend line amounts to, is about a day a year that we've added to these cattle. So in 1990, average days on feed for steers was around 140 days, and about 138 days, 140 days, right at that 140-day mark, okay, not to repeat myself, on both steers and heifers in 1990. As you go to 2023, we've increased that now to 190 and 184, okay? That line has steadily increased, right? We used to talk when I was an undergrad, I'm not going to say how long that was, Monty, but it was getting to be a long time ago. We used to talk about days on feed is somewhere between 120 and 150. Yeah, no, it was probably closer to 140. We just didn't really know any better at that time. So if we think about days on feed, that's about 47 more days on the steers and 46 days on the heifers. So as an increase, that's about a 32% increase in days on feed, okay? All right, let's talk about average daily gain. Just like that exit weight, both of those slopes are going up. We've increased performance on cattle as we go from 1990 to 2023. So it's about 0.012 pounds of average daily gain per month. Okay, it's about a half a pound in 33 years. Those numbers get pretty small when you look at them per month. One of the things I've come to appreciate, just like I said before, change is happening every month when we turn these closeouts in, right? We just don't realize the rate at which it's changing. It's very slow and it creeps up over time. Okay, so in 1990, steers were gaining just a touch over 3 pounds a day on average. Heifers were about a quarter of a pound behind those steers at 2.75. If we go to 2023, that annual average was 3.43 and a little over 3 pounds a day on the heifers. So we've got about a 0.34 and 0.31 increase in average daily gain on both steers and heifers. That's just a little over an 11% improvement in average daily gain. So we made them bigger, we feed them a little longer, they're gaining weight a little faster. You hear the story, right? It's starting to take shape. Okay, now let's talk about feed efficiency, okay? All right, we'll see if everybody's paying attention. What's the first thing that jumps out at you guys on that graph? 1993, right? Look at that spike in feed conversion. Mr. Latterell, what would cause that spike? What happened in 1993? Because I know you were feeding cattle. We did. We had a really bad winter, okay? My family was involved in the cattle operation in central Kansas. We spent the whole winter, I was in high school, with feed trucks chained to tractors, okay? It obviously wasn't much better in the feedlot industry, okay? It was a pretty rough winter. I didn't go back and look to see how much, snow they received in western Kansas or anything like that, but when you're looking at a 9-to-1 feed conversion, that's a pretty tough winter in Kansas, especially in western Kansas. So you see some spikes there. We've also got another spike. 2019, right? 2019, 38 inches of snow in Garden City, Kansas at my house. I put 50 hours on a tractor pushing snow, okay? It shows up in the data. There's that impact of weather, right? So some of those things we can make real. So let's talk about the slope, okay? Now those two lines look a little different, right? The slope for steers versus heifers, the pink line versus the blue line. There's a little bit of a difference there. So in terms of steers, we've reduced feed to gain by 0.27, okay? Okay? So we've reduced feed to gain by 4.1% over that 33 years time span on the steers. If we look at that heifer slope, right, it's maybe not moving as dramatically in that improved feed to gain direction as what the steers would be. Okay, so we've only seen a reduction there of about 2.3% in 33 years. So the slopes start to separate when we start to talk about feed efficiency. So average feed to gain in 1990, we were looking at 6.5 to 1 on the steers and 6.75 on the heifers. We go to 2023, we're at 6.3 and 6.7. Okay, so think about those averages, that 4.1 and that 2.3. Okay, and start to we'll talk about that one a little bit more, and maybe why there's some differences there, especially as we get into this comparison between 1990 and 2023, as we talk about those 5-year trends. Okay, so here's death loss. It's really fun to follow Dr. Thompson, right? Hey, we talk about death loss. We always talk about managing cattle. We always talk about health. Why? Because it's always important. Here's the other thing about death loss. Which direction are those lines moving? Wow. So with all this advancement, better technology, sorry veterinary community, you're doing a great job, but it's still a problem. Okay? It's still a problem. Okay? So if we look at death loss, essentially death loss in heifers has increased at a rate of 0.0032 per month. So it's just continually climbing up. Okay? It's about 1.26% over the 33 years time span for the heifers. And the steers is 0.0025. And if I flipped those a minute ago, sorry, on the steers. And it's just a little under a 1% increase in death loss over 33 years. Okay? So I wish it was flat. I wish it wasn't changing. The reality of it is it's still going up. It's still a problem for us. And that's a common theme. We'll talk about that in lots of different ways today. Okay, death loss is a little bit unique. Initially, in the focus on feedlots, they didn't ask for death loss. Okay? If you're a cattle feeder, you want to tell everybody sometimes when you just really, no, probably not. So about 1994, that's when we start to get really consistent in terms of, I got a pretty complete data set in terms of death loss. So 1994, death loss, average annual death loss is 0.73 and 0.78. So we were below 1% death loss on average, okay, in 1990. Now that's probably the feed yard managers that were willing to share their death loss, because I can tell you there's some missing observations in that data set, okay? So that's okay, okay? We still know. Now as we fast forward to 2023, we're running closer to 2%. A little over 2 on the steers, and about 2.3 on the heifers. So a lot of times when I have conversations with producers, there seems to be this mentality of, well, what's average death loss on a set of cattle as stocker operators? What's that look like? And I hear this number that gets thrown at about 1%. You know, death loss was 1% at one time, but today if we need a better number to pull out, it's probably closer to 2%. Okay, that's a pretty good benchmark to just stay below. That's where it's at on average. Okay, so here's cost of gain. Okay, I debated whether to put this one in there, but I thought, hey, we collect it. It just kind of tells the story of the industry of where we've been. So just like exit weights and everything else, okay, this is not adjusted for inflation, because I don't know. I could probably figure out how to do that, but I'm going to give you the numbers that we capture. So this is cost of gain. So if we started off, the slope is certainly there. It's certainly an increasing trend, right? What jumps out about this graph? Well, let's just see if these click in here. Look at the rate of change in cost of gain and how quickly it changed in 11 and 12 and 21, 22, and 23 relative to the change in cost of gain over time as we get back into the 90s, right? We saw some increases in cost of gain back here, right? But nothing like these two peaks that are in this graph that we saw in 11 and 12 and later on in 20 and 23. Okay? So for those of you that can remember 50-cent cost of gains, okay, that's where they were at in the 1990s, steers and heifers. 2023, we were talking about cost of gains of $1.40 and $1.50. Okay? The good part about that is that's not the highest cost of gains we've ever recorded in the data set. Okay? It actually come down in 2023. You guys will see that here in a little bit. I'll point out where that highest cost of gain is at. But I think as we think about some of the challenges of our industry, this is one of them. That's that market volatility. Okay? You know, things are pretty steady here. We saw some increases, we saw some spikes, but man, you know, now what we're seeing there, you know, especially here, just if we just looked at that time period there, it's going to rapidly increase. Okay, so 33 years. Let's talk about what hasn't changed. Okay, and there's two big ones. Okay, so weather variability, hot and cold. As you look at some of the impacts, we talked about the impacts of feed conversion. That's where we see it the most. I like to use this set of cattle because this is my first set of research cattle that were stressed, high stress calves. That's what we're supposed to do for the research study. Dr. Dan, they didn't eat for a month. Okay, they came from the south and we dropped them off in Hayes in October. Okay, I never forgot those cattle because they just never ate, and the closeout looked like you'd expect. It didn't go well. Okay. We also got market volatility. I think that's a big one. The other part that's in this data set that I think just jumps out here is death loss. And if you look at that long term, you know, it's still trending upward. You know, what do we do with that? Is that a management issue? Is that an artifact of cattle? Okay. Is it an artifact of days on feed? Okay. Sometimes I do think graph days on feed against death loss, and guess what? There's a relationship there. You would expect one, right? As you increase days on feed, what's going to happen to death loss? Just think about the insurance industry. The longer you live, the greater the probability that something bad's going to happen and you're probably going to expire. We see that in the data set. The other thing I didn't present to you was in weights. In weights have stayed relatively consistent in this data set over the last 33 years. So you say, well, is it a function of in weight or are they placing lighter cattle? We've placed 7-weight cattle in the feed yards in this data set for about the last 30 years. Okay? So it's really not a story about in weight in my mind. It's more, you know, maybe there's a piece of days on feed. Maybe there's something about, you know, cattle. You know, is there a price for increasing that performance potentially? So I think so. All right, so what has changed? 237 pounds of live weight on average in that 33-year trend line. That's what that would represent. That's a 20% increase in live weight based on the trend line, not in to out. Okay, we've increased gain about a half a pound a day, 16%. We've improved feed to gain 2% on the heifers and 4% on the steers. And we do it in about 30 more days on feed. Okay? Why does all of that matter? Okay? When I think about a lot of the conversations we're having about sustainability, and this is where I go with it, that's a pretty exciting story, right? We ought to be talking about that. As you think about pounds of beef produced in the U.S. per cow, per acre, man, if you had a business and you increased your output by 20%, you did it, the rate at which you did it in terms of average daily gain went up 16%, and you were 4% more efficient in the way that you produced X, that's a pretty exciting story, okay? I'm not sure what makes a coffee cup sustainable. I really don't care, but as I think about sustainability in the beef industry, this is a big part of that story. I think it's one we ought to be talking a little bit about. The other thing that goes into that is, what's the economic value of those 200 pounds of additional live weight, right? You know, think about that in terms of food service meals. What does that equate to, right? That's worth a lot more in terms of the productivity. I've never went back and looked at those numbers. That's probably something I should do is look at that value there. So what's represented in this data set, right? Because I get to give this talk and I talk to cow-calf guys and talking to stock operators today. Ironically, I don't present it a lot in terms of feedlot operators because they live and breathe it every day. So, but what's represented in here? And as I look at it, okay, have we changed our genetics? Yeah, we have definitely changed our genetics. Do we understand more about the fundamentals and the basics of nutrition? Yeah, we do. We're still working on it. We still got some research we need to do. But you think about nutrition, technology, and management. One of the things I used to say is there's a lot of feeding technology from 1990 to 2023. That's a relatively modern era of the cattle feeding industry. we're still utilizing some of those foundational technologies. It's not like we went from technology A and then we adopted technology B and it made things that much better, right? We've got some of that, right? There's some things in there we can talk about, but it's really the convergence of all of those things, and it takes all of those pieces. I've oftentimes been asked the question, well, could you sift out the impact of, an implant program or genetics? Not really. Not in these numbers. But I think what you need to know as an industry is it's all in there, and this is how much better we are today than we were 33 years ago. I think that's pretty exciting. Hopefully you can hopefully I'm conveying that, but I think it's a pretty exciting story. Okay? Any questions about the long-term trends? Okay. All right. Hopefully I'm making it somewhat entertaining for you guys. So let's talk about the short-term and recent trends. Now the question you should have been asking yourself is, you got a guy that's got 33 years of data here. Why did he pick the last 5 years to talk about the beef industry? Why would I pick the last 5 years? Okay? Monty, we were talking about this the last 5 years has really been exciting in some good ways and in some not so great ways, right? Okay? So think about 2019, one of the biggest impacts, right? We had this whole COVID thing. We decided we were going to shut things down. Well, what's that do if you're a processing plant? Kind of backs some things up, makes it harder to get some cattle through the system. Okay? That was an impact. Okay? To add insult to injury in western Kansas, and this data set's going to be heavily weighted towards the southern plains. What did we have in August of 2019? A little fire at one of our processing plants. Okay? Okay? The stated impact of the Tyson plant in western Kansas is they have about 6% of the nation's fed slaughter. Okay? I don't know what the percentage is in the yards that I capture data from, but what I can tell you is it's bigger than 6%. There's a lot of cattle out of these yards that are going to go to Tyson. The other part about the last 5 years is we crossed some new highs. That's what's made it exciting, right? We saw the highest average market weight across these 6 feed yards that I've ever recorded. Okay? The highest days on feed. Okay? The highest cost to gain. Okay? All right? And unfortunately, some of the highest death loss that we've seen in the data set as well. Okay? So, fun in some ways, not so fun in some others. So let's look at these recent trends. So this is market weight from 2019 to July of 2024. Okay? So much smaller data set. Here you can kind of see where the lines start to separate just a little bit here. Okay? Market weight, really pretty the same slope for both of those, so I didn't shoot the trend line there. What jumps out to you guys about that steer line? Have we been below 1,400 pounds much in the last 5 years? Nope. We really haven't dropped below 1,400 pounds. Probably more surprising is when we start to talk about heifers. Okay? Heifers increasingly right at 1,300 pounds. It's coming up just a little bit there. We are adding. So highest market weight on average out of those 6 feed yards, okay, was 1,496 right there. I think that's December of 2023. Okay? Now, if you think about that's the average across 6 yards. What did the individual pen closeouts look like for some of those yards in terms of exit weights? Okay? Yep, 12 to 1,800. There were some big cattle to pull that average up that high. Okay? So that 5-year average, if we look at that, is 1,427. July 2024, we're at 1,450 and 1,303. It's really not moving a whole lot. They're staying pretty steady in terms of those exit weights. In fact, I'm probably going to show you a little bit here of an increase. In terms of days on feed, it gets a little more interesting here. Okay? So you see that jumps around just a little bit. 5-year average was 183 days on the steers, 176 on the heifers over the last 5-year period. What's interesting to me about this particular data here in this graph is what's starting to happen about January of 2023. We're not moving that number a whole lot. We're pretty much killing steers and heifers right around 200 days. I mean, they're coming together. We're not seeing, regardless of the seasonal changes here, okay, these seasonal differences in terms of days on feed. But as we get to January 2023, it really doesn't matter what time of year it is, we're feeding them for about the same amount of days on feed, 185 to 200 days. Doesn't matter if it's a steer or a heifer. That's just how long they're going to be in a feed yard. That's a little bit of a shift. We haven't seen that before. That's a change. See, I had it highlighted in there. I just didn't click the box, right? Okay, so average daily gain. Okay, I'll give you guys a minute to digest that one because this one's an interesting one. Okay, so what direction was the long-term trend for average daily gain moving? It was going up. Okay, now as we look at the last 5 years, what direction is the trend line going for average daily gain? It's going the other way. It's going down. Okay, it's starting to trend down in the last 5 years. So our 5-year average was 3.5, 3.19. If you think about where we're at in terms of that long-term trend line, kind of right on the projection. But as you go to 2024, relative to that 5-year benchmark in terms of average daily gain, we're below it for both steers and heifers, 3.3 and 3.15 on the heifers there. Okay, let's look at feed conversion. Okay, so one of the things about graphs, I always feel like I need to pause so you guys can see them because I've seen them a lot before. Give you guys a minute to think about those graphs in terms of steers and heifers. Okay, what's one thing we note in terms of those two trend lines? There's a lot of overlap. There's not a whole lot of separation between them in the last 5-year period here. Okay, where is the general slope of that line going? It's fairly flat, but it's starting to go up. Okay, so we're going to tell the story here in just a little bit. So 6.2 on the 5-year average, 6.5 on the heifers, 6.2 and 6.6. So this is death loss for that 5-year period as well. Okay, heifers are still higher than the steers, right? We kind of expect that, right? We've seen that before. Okay, where do you see the peaks and valleys in the last 5 years in death loss? Do you see a pattern? Look at the spikes. Midsummer, 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 and here everything kind of comes together, but we still got a little bit of that trend. Death loss is becoming very cyclical in the last 5 years. Okay, I don't know that I have a good explanation for it. Okay, I'm not going to try to explain it, but when I saw this, when I graphed this 5-year data, I'm like, you know, I've heard feed yard managers talk about this. I've heard other veterinary consulting groups start to talk about those trends that they've seen, that there's a seasonal increase in death loss. Okay, these cattle would have closed out June, July of those respective years. So when would they have been on feed? Dr. Tarpoff, first quarter of the year, right? So there's something there, right? I mean, when you see a pattern that repeats over a 5-year period of time, there's something there. That's something that's going on. The other part that you start to see here a little bit towards the end here is we're starting to see some convergence there, starting to come together a little bit. We'll talk about that a little bit here in terms of this kind of the long-term stuff here, but it is starting to move together, maybe becoming a little less cycle, but that repeating cycle in there, I hadn't picked that up before. Okay, so that was something new for me in graphing the 5-year trend with this particular data set. Okay, let's talk a little bit about cost of gain. Okay, so as we'd expect, this is the tail end of that other graph. This is what one of those peaks look like, right? So highest recorded cost of gain was 160 2025, right about January of 2023. Somewhere in there, I'd have to look at that particular deal to see where we're at. 5-year average, we've been running well over $1, 107, 113. July 24, we're 109 and 118. What's the good news out of this cost of gain story? Starting to come down. Okay, that's the good part of this story, is it's starting to come down. I think we've hit the peak. Okay, and it's moving in the right direction for those of us in the cattle industry, right? Now, if you're a corn farmer, maybe not so much, but it is moving in the right direction. I have neighbors that are corn farmers, so they often remind me what's good for me, not necessarily good for them. That's okay. We're on different sides of it. So what did we learn from 2019 to 2024? What did we learn? What did all of those events kind of teach us in the industry? Okay? I'll make it simple for you. We could make them bigger, okay? And the penalty wasn't as bad as what we thought it was going to be. We didn't give up as much performance on a lot of these cattle in those unique events that happened due to COVID, due to a plant shutdown. I think this is when, as an industry in the Southern Plains, we started to take note of, we can make cattle bigger, and it didn't hurt us as much as we thought it would. And it's kind of just an interesting shift that those things actually taught us a lot about the industry right there, that we could do that. The other thing, the death loss deal. I said we're going to keep kind of touching back to that. There's some interesting things that are starting to show up with the cyclicity of that. If we look at that, here's what we would expect. As I increase days on feed, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to increase exit weights. We're going to increase carcass weight. Those are all good things. But I'm going to see a downward trend in average daily gain in feed conversion. Okay? And so that's kind of where I think we're at in terms of that 5-year trend. We're starting to see some of those things. Okay? So I don't know where I'm at on time. I'm probably pushing up close to it. But so Dale said I had to get to future trends. Okay? And I've struggled with this a little bit because I don't like to go outside the data. But somebody said, hey, just tell them, just stand up there and tell them what you think. Okay? My crystal ball is a little bit fuzzy. I'm not going to go out more than 2 years on this deal. Okay? But here's what I can tell you. So you ever heard this one? Pounds pays the bills. And that wouldn't be any more true today than what it's ever been. Okay? That incentive right there, okay, what do we get paid on in the feedlot industry in the Southern Plains? And in the Northern Plains, we get paid on carcass weight, right? That's the number one determinant of the size of the check, if you really think about it. We are a carcass weight driven market. So carcass weight is probably, if we had to vote for the number one economically relevant trait, that's probably it, is carcass weight. Okay? So here's the good thing. So we're going to probably continue to push weights and days on feed a little bit in the industry. The bigger question that I'm hearing from feed yard managers right now is, how big can we make them? Right? How big can we make them? Okay? And then the other side of that equation is, I've got some folks that are starting to say, this death loss, are we pushing them too far? So that we're kind of dividing ourselves into two camps, or some of us are concerned about that. But as I look at it in the next 2 to 3 years, this isn't going to change. We're going to continue as an industry. We're going to continue to push those fed cattle weights up. We're going to try to put more carcass on the rail. I think that's pretty much a given. There's a couple things. Think about cost of gain. Those are coming down, okay? But if you're a cattle feeder, okay, what's your cost to refill a pen versus the cost of additional days on feed? More and more, that's the conversation, okay? If I got to go out there and pay more for those feeders, right, maybe I just keep the ones I've got a few more days and hang a little bit more up on the rail, okay? Now, historically, when we've talked about increasing carcass weights, we've kind of heard this thing about pushback from the packer. Well, I got this heavyweight discount, would really like to be out there. You know what I'm sensing right now? There's really, when you talk to people, what heavyweight discount? Okay, what heavyweight discount? Okay? That's becoming more of our mindset, okay? So what that tells me is both, that's not that the packer still doesn't have a heavyweight discount. We've got packer and retailer acceptance, okay? They seem very willing to take bigger cattle. They haven't pushed back on us yet, right? And said, oh, hey, they're getting too big. No, we haven't had that conversation. I think the retail sector is starting to prep itself in terms of how they're going to present larger cuts in some of these higher-end restaurants. That's a shift. It's going to shift from presentation. Yes, we've talked about, does something fit the plate? Well, maybe it doesn't have to fit the plate anymore. Maybe it has to fit the table. Okay? So let's shift that a little bit. That one piece of meat and how they prepare it's going to fit the table. Does it fit the table? Think about a tomahawk steak, right? Okay? Pretty hard to mess that one up, right? It's probably going to give you a pretty good positive eating experience. Most of that is going to be, you talk with Tondra, it's cattle supply. They know they're going to get tough to find, and so they're completely okay with them getting a little bit bigger. The other part of it is, okay, if you got a carcass, a 1,000-pound carcass and a 1,200-pound carcass, and you're the packer, it costs you just as much to pull the hide off of a 1,000-pound one as it does a 1,200-pound, right? And we have to start to talking about some things of where's the value in a carcass, right, in terms of the grind and some of those other things. So I don't see that changing, okay? As exit weights and days on feed increase, are we going to see further increases or decreases in average daily gain and feed to grain? Yeah, I think they're probably going to flatline. I mean, as you make those, that's what the trend would indicate. They're starting to move the different direction. There's no longer that steady upward trend in terms of cattle performance. Okay, we've also got the death loss side of that. Okay, so I just told you that I think the trend on an average basis on cattle is that we're going to see kind of average daily gain and feed conversion start to flatten out. Feed conversion is probably going to go up just a little bit. Average daily gain is going to go down. Okay? However, in some yards, I get to see the individual pen closeouts, the same closeout report that the nutritionist gives. You want to know what I've started to see in those closeouts? The average doesn't represent some of the cattle that are in those yards. There are some rock stars, okay? We're talking steers gaining well over 4 pounds a day, converting in the upper 5s, okay? These are kind of the exciting cattle, and guess what? They're bumping 1,500 pounds when they left, okay? Okay, if we talk about the heifers, the same thing's true, okay? We've got some heifers that are posting performance numbers that are knocking on the doors of the lower quality steers that are on feed with them at the same time, okay? So we've got some really good cattle individually. The question in my mind is, are we going to start to see more of those cattle, and what's that going to do to the average, okay? And if you think about it from kind of the steers versus heifers perspective, okay, and I put some of these graphs up here, the 33-year improvement in feed to gainer, that trend, I won't say in terms of steers and heifers, was 4% for the steers and 2% for heifers in the long-term trend. Okay? That's that graph there. Okay, that's 2019 from 2024. Feed conversion is kind of right on top of each other in terms of steers versus heifers. Okay? Let's look at average daily gain. Yeah, they're still parallel, right? But look at some of these heifers. They're knocking on the door of that steer trend line. So you asked me to prognosticate a little bit, okay? Here's what I think. I think there's some pretty good heifers that are starting to come into the pipeline, okay? Is there a reason for that? Are we sending more heifers, right? Are we maybe getting the better ones? Is that going to overcome it? Well, I guess what I'm starting to tell you is I think the gap between the steers and the heifers is going to start to narrow. Now the steers might run away and keep getting better too, okay? That's what makes this fun, right? We get to see whether Waggoner's like right or what am I seeing in the numbers, because this one's kind of wild. But more and more of those heifer closeouts that I'm looking at them on an individual line basis, I'm looking at them going, wow, those are pretty good, right? You know, it used to be you could look at a closeout and go, yeah, steer or heifer, you could almost sort it. You got to be careful doing that today. Hey, let's talk a little bit about beef on dairy. We talked about this particular group of cattle earlier today, okay? If you're a cattle feeder, there's nothing but opportunity here, right? I think there's tremendous opportunity in these cattle. I'm surprised as an industry we didn't see it sooner. Hey, that's the thing. Now, there's some things, there's the reason we didn't. Okay, so in my mind, the performance and quality of this class of cattle will continue to improve. There's a concerted genetic effort to make these cattle better, and they've done it in a relatively short period of time. How can they do that? Well, if you think about this particular animal, okay, we likely know the day it was conceived. We have the potential at every point in the value chain to capture data on that calf, right? How long does it take us to feed that data back and make a change? 2 or 3 years ago, I was with a genetics company doing a presentation for them, and I started to realize they were starting to do sire selection specifically for certain sets of beef on dairy cattle that would fit a particular environment. You know, that not every beef sire was going to make, needed to be crossed on that dairy cow. They were looking at things like muscle shape and some things that I hadn't even thought of, right? They were already ahead of that. Okay? I don't know if this picture shows up very well. Okay? This is a pen of beef on dairy cattle. Okay? I wish it was clear, because the only one of these steers in that pen that looks like the traditional Holstein cross is this kind of this black-headed one at the bump. The rest of them, if you look close, you can see some things that maybe give you an indication that it's beef on dairy. There's Charolais, there's Simmental, there's all that stuff represented, and these are good cattle. I didn't get the numbers on them, but they do not look like your traditional beef on dairy steer. They're going to continue to get better and better. So this is another one of those measurements that's kind of fun, and I debated about putting this slide in there. I said, well, where are we going with this? What's a big future trend that's kind of way out there? Okay, so have you ever thought about what's the end point in our industry? It's carcass, right? How do we evaluate cattle performance? How do we think about cattle performance? On a live weight basis. Increasingly in the industry, we've been talking about this thing, right? About live weight to carcass weight transfer. Okay? I spend a lot of time driving, and I start to think about these things. I'm like, why do we think about average daily gain on a live basis? when we start thinking about average daily gain on a carcass basis, right? How do we get there as an industry? And so this is a bit of a stretch. I don't have all the answers, but there's some really neat things that are being done at the end of the finishing period, okay? We already know what carcass weight looks like there. What I want to know is what's carcass composition of a 7-weight steer that originated from the southern U.S. on the front end of the feeding period. That's where we need to go. I don't have the answers for that, but I think that's the direction we're moving. How do I take carcass and body composition and make a management tool for a cattle feeder on the front end that allows them to sort those cattle into outcome groups that determines performance and days on feed? And I'm getting lots of blank looks about where he's going with that. But that's the direction I think we're going to do. You start to thinking about 3-dimensional scans of cattle at arrival, right? We've had the old system where we took the tape measure and measured hip height and width, and we put that into a formula. We can do better. The other thing that we have today is we can aggregate data quicker than what we have ever been able to before, okay? So I think increasingly we're going to start to see the industry start to shift away. We're still going to do live performance because that's how we send the bills, right? We're still going to do that, but we're going to start managing cattle on this carcass basis, okay? And we've tried to do that before, okay? Some other things that might have value for you as stocker operators in the Focus on Feedlot data set. I also do a regression with corn price, essentially trying to say, if I know corn price, can I predict projected costs of gain? Can I do that? Does that have some value to you guys if you're looking at retained ownership? Do that for both steers and heifers. Okay, if you're fairly intuitive, you'll notice that I did it from 2009 to 2019. There's a reason for that. Okay, my R squared right there is 0.93. That's the best I can get it in terms of that data set. When I throw everything from 2020 forward, it really doesn't do a very good job. Okay, that's what I'll tell you. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But this is a really good benchmark for both steers and heifers if you want to look at, well, what's feedlot cost to gain? We can do a lot with that number in terms of what's the value of a backgrounding program, what's the value of wheat pasture cattle, etc. Okay, if you want to extrapolate those numbers out, okay, this is what that formula would give you. So essentially, if you're at 550 corn, it would predict the steer cost to gain in 94 and 98. You can just insert those from the futures market. But that's a really good tool, I think, that tries to help producers. I used to get that question a lot. Well, what's projected cost to gain in the feed yard? Well, if I know corn price, and most cattle feeders have some sort of equation that they're going to use to do that. Okay? If that wasn't enough graphs for you, okay, typically in the odd years, I will publish what I call the Focus on Feedlots Annual Review. And it is basically most of the graphs in terms of those long-term trends. I'll graph 3 years. It's kind of become whatever I'm feeling for the year is what I'll put in this publication, and I'll kind of summarize the things that I think are the most relevant. We're due probably for a revision on that. The last one was in 2019, or that's the 2019 one showing up there. We got another revision that's more current than that one. So with that, the last thing I want to leave you with, if you do not receive the Focus on Feedlot, but you'd like to receive it, all you got to do is send me an email. We're not fancy. There's no online click here and I'm going to collect all your information. Yes, I have your email address, but that's all I really need from you. We distribute the Focus on Feedlots right now to somewhere between 400 and 500 people each month that directly get the email, okay? If you want the Excel database, graduate students, just if you want to play with different things, that is open access. All you have to do is send me an email. I've kind of started to lock that one down a little bit. We used to just put it online, but then I didn't really know who was grabbing the data. And it's always fun when you see numbers that you collect in somebody else's presentation and you go, wow, they never talked to me. And so that's one of the reasons I started to make that available upon request, is just so I could start to get a better sense of how that data was being used. I will get requests from all across the world, Australia, that are looking at the Focus on Feedlots. You truly don't realize the impacts of some of the things that go on in the university. Academia utilize this data set, industry uses it, the financial analysts, etc. So Dale's up here. It probably means it's time for me to answer a few questions or get quiet. So it's always a pleasure to be here for Stocker Day. I enjoy the opportunity to come. Dr. Blasey does a great job for us. If you got any questions, we can probably take a couple and walk back through the data. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I'll do my best. Okay, Mr. Holders asked the question, do all the feedlots turn in all of their closeout figures? Yes. By and large, the cooperating feed yards that I work with today, I see the same reports that they're using internally, that they're sharing with their nutritionists, that they're sharing with their veterinary consultant, etc. So if they're lying to me, they're lying to everybody else too. That's how I usually like to answer that question. They're very willing to share that data. So we don't get that. Well, I just don't want to send in my numbers this month. We just don't see that anymore. For backgrounds feeders, that's a great suggestion. Zach? Yep. Yeah, so I'll try to summarize that. And I think your question is, well, could you take this data and start to sort it out and look at different cattle types within the data set? So I'll answer the question. Not in the data that I receive, and sometimes I have to be very cautious about the questions I ask, because data has value internally. What I would tell you is internally, many of those feed yards are doing just exactly what they are starting to figure that out. That's why that data has tremendous value to them. If you're a large corporate cattle feeder with several feed yards, right, you're going to figure that out. And so I know that that's being done, but not at the level that I get the data. Some of them I get a simple Excel sheet that's just got the averages. There's others that I get to see the individual closeouts. Warm out.